I've been working very hard on this, and I hope it bring you new information, and I hope you enjoy it. So good communication and the ability to gather intelligence are vital to fighting and winning wars, and the Civil War was no exception to this rule. What was an exception, however, was the rapid and drastic changes that the Industrial Revolution brought to the battlefield. The introduction of the railroad and telegraph are two examples of industrialization and advances in technology that changed the structure of communication and intelligence gathering during the Civil War, and conceivably changing its outcome. Considered by many to be the first modern war, new tactics and strategy developed would forever change how wars would be fought. Although the Civil War was a technologically advanced war, it was also caught between the old and the new, as drums, bugles, and regimental flags would prove to be as critical on the battlefield as the telegraph. To fully understand the significance of industrialization, we must look at it in the context of a century of rapid and drastic change, including how war would be conducted. As Grant says, war is progressive because all of the instruments and elements of war are progressive. He understood that this was a time in which new advances in industry, science, and technology would be readily applied to the conduct of war. The railroad allowed armies to be bigger and more mobile. New technology made it possible to mass-produce weapons with enhanced accuracy, power, and range. Firepower improved in its effectiveness by increasing the range and accuracy of rifled weapons. The improvement enlarged the killing zone and made close-order tactics suicidal. The discovery of fossil fuels and industrialization impacted almost every facet of day-to-day military operations during the Civil War. And because of that, the Civil War saw the death of many traditional modes of warfare as the birth of new innovations commenced. As we begin to examine different modes of communication, the spoken word played an important role during the Civil War. It was one of the simplest methods, but one that most soldiers would be familiar with. When civilians entered military service, their oral customs went with them. From top brass to lowly privates, their news, orders, gossip, instructions, warnings, passwords, and taunts came chiefly through voice, partly by necessity. Somewhere between 5 and 10% of Union soldiers could not read or write. For Confederates, that proportion was near to 20%. In some remote rural areas, illiteracy reached 40%. In addition, officers and sergeants on both sides worked around a shortage of manuals, maps, time, and paper. Enlisted men spent interminable hours in drill, learning to perform via simple verbal cues. Move at the quick step, wheel right, charge bayonets, etc. While this was a simple and familiar form of communication, it was not without its problems. Without written instructions, detailed orders were easily forgotten, misrepresented, or refuted. During the Battle of Fair Oaks, for example, the otherwise dependable James Longstreet either forgot or misunderstood verbal orders and marched his troops down the wrong road in the wrong direction. Communicating with family through letters was imperative in keeping up morale. The United States Postal Service gives insight to the importance of mail during the Civil War and says that mail was a treasured link between Civil War camps and battlefields and back home. Recognizing its importance to morale, the armies assigned personnel to collect, distribute, and deliver soldiers' mail. Wagons and tents served as traveling post offices. It was reported that many regimes sent out an average of 600 letters per day. It was reported that a soldier who kept track of his own outgoing mail reported that in 1863 he sent out 109 letters to home folk, 55 letters to other friends, and another 37 letters were written by him for fellows who could not write. He was pleased that he received 85 letters in return. At that time, it cost 3 cents to send a letter and 10 cents to send a letter out to the far west. There was a shortage of ink, paper, and postage stamps in the South, limiting the amount of mail sent from the Confederate post office. One Confederate soldier wrote home, "It is a constant, incessant complaint in the Army in regard to not receiving any letters from home and their friends and relatives, not receiving those they write to them. There is quite a deficit somewhere, not to say gross negligence on the part of someone." After a switch to the Confederate Postal Department in the June of 1861, the department found themselves without any postage stamps, and the supply never met the demand, and the problem of not receiving mail continued. The United States banned the exchange of mail between citizens of the North and the South in August of 1861, although smugglers often carried mail illegally across the lines. Confederate and Union prisoners were allowed to exchange mail through the flag of truce ships and was exchanged between the North and South at designated points. These letters usually were enclosed within an inner, unsealed envelope that bore enemy stamps or was sent postage due. The outer cover was destroyed after the contents were censored, and as indicated by proper markings and endorsements on the envelope carrying the letter to its destination. And you can see the prisoner's letter examination stamp there. As battle ensued, communication between leaders and their men was vital. Using drums and bugles as a form of communication during combat was developed during the Revolutionary War, and their use continued throughout the Civil War. These particular instruments were used to signal commands on the battlefield because of their distinguishable sound against weaponry and the boom of artillery fire. Drums were mainly used for infantry, and bugles were used for the cavalry and mounted artillery, and both instruments were just as essential during battle as they were in camp. In camp, there were at least 40 different bugle calls that soldiers were required to memorize. As you can imagine, it would have been hard for new soldiers to remember what each one meant. So these young men quickly learned to follow the more seasoned soldiers as to what to do each time the bugle sounded a tune. These instruments also provided inspiration to troops in both the battlefield and in camp. These buglers were typically grown men because of the need for greater lung power, but there were no strict age limits requirements for drummers, so many were young boys as young as 12. The military thought that these boys were too young to use a gun and wanted to protect them from seeing the worst of war. However, they would often serve as stretcher bearers and other roles of assistance to medical staff. So they actually did see probably the worst war actually had to offer. One of the youngest and most famous drummers was a boy named Johnny Clem. I bet at least half of you have probably heard of this young man, but I felt that he was worth putting in the presentation because of his accomplishments. He ran away from home at the age of 9 to join the Army. The Army turned him away, one officer telling him that the Army is not enlisting infants. But after refusing to go home, troops from Michigan adopted him as their mascot and drummer boy. Officers even contributed some of their pay so he could earn a soldier's salary of $13 a month and had a little uniform made for him. Clem was present at the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863, where he reportedly wielded a rifle and shot a Confederate officer. He was later captured, but due to all of the confusion of the battle, he managed to escape. Because of his tenacity and spirit, he became known as the drummer boy of Chickamauga. By the time he was 11, he enlisted as a regular soldier, and after serving in the military for 55 years, he would retire a brigadier general in 1915. Flags were vital to communication and had several roles. One of these roles was that of regimental and national flags. Amongst the Civil War's most significant of innovations, the rifle barrel changed the nature of warfare. While muskets made opposing forces stand in relatively close quarters to another to get an accurate shot, rifles allowed soldiers to shoot at a range of 1,000 yards, expanding the size of the battlefield. This expanded battlefield prompted the need for visual communication, as verbal commands and bugle calls could not be heard on noisy battlefields, so regimental flags marked the position of the regiment on the battlefield. With the noise and smoke of battle, regiments could become scattered, so a visual rally point was critical, so the soldiers were trained to follow the flag. Battle flags had a strategic importance in battle, so there were designated teams of soldiers who carried them. These soldiers were known as the color guard, and they would consist of 2 color bearers. One carried the national flag, and the other carried the regimental flag. While being a color bearer was considered a mark of great distinction, it required a soldier of extraordinary bravery, as they were a highly visible target for the enemy. Regimental flags may have been one of the most primitive forms of communication, but it was one of the most cherished and protected forms of communication. Armies from both Union and Confederate tended to be organized as regiments from their respective state, so it was a soldier's inclination to be exclusively loyal towards that regiment from their home state. The flag would be protected during battle, and men would sacrifice their lives defending it. If the color bearer was wounded or killed during the battle, the flag would be picked up by another soldier, and they would take on the role as color bearer. It was considered a disgrace if a flag was captured by the enemy. Conversely, it was considered a great triumph to capture the enemy's battle flag. And I would be remiss if I didn't show you the 42nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regimental flag. So this is Garfield's flag. So this is his regimental flag, and this was his national flag. So this flag served as a national colors for the 42nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. There are 37 gold painted stars on a blue canton. The stars are arranged in 2 concentric circles surrounding 2 middle stars. There is also 1 star in each of the canton's 4 corners. The flag has 13 alternating red and white stripes and gold fringe on its top, right, and bottom sides. Now, they said that this flag was used in President Garfield's funeral service. All right, now we're going to talk about Albert Meyer. Some of you may have actually heard of this man. He was had his hands in a lot of things during the Civil War. Several years prior to the start of the war, a man named Albert Meyer found inspiration in creating a new signaling system utilizing a flag after working in an American Indian territory in the 1850s. He noticed Native Americans communicating across long distances by waving staffs to each other, which gave him the idea of combining flags and codes to convey a message. Having a history of developing different forms of communication, this would have been something that certainly would have piqued his interest. Meyer enrolled in Geneva College at the young age of 13. He graduated in 1847, and then he went on to study medicine in Buffalo, New York. While studying to be a doctor, Meyer worked in the office of the New York State Telegraph Company. In 1854, 3 years after receiving his medical degree, Meyer joined the Army as an assistant surgeon and was ordered to Texas. It is in Texas that he finds the inspiration from the Native Americans and begins to develop a military signaling system and bases it on his medical dissertation, A New Sign Language for Deaf Mutes. Drawing on his experience as a telegraph operator, Meyer transformed the Bain telegraph code into a means of personal communication by which words could be spelled out by tapping them on a person's cheek or their hand. He then converted this sign language into the flag and torch signaling system that has become known as wigwag. And don't call it wigwam. That was a no-no back then. Meyer worked on perfecting his system of communication, and after proving you could transfer a message over 15 miles, he won the notice of the U.S. Senate's Committee on Military Affairs, who then fully embraced this aerial telegraphy known as wigwag. So now, that's kind of an unusual term, so you may wonder, why wigwag? Well, it came from untrained persons who felt that the flags swung around in no particular manner, so the term wigwag was given to the flags. Unlike semaphore signaling, which employed 2 flags, wigwag required just 1. In general, there were 3 basic flag signals used. A wave to the left signaled 1, a wave to the right signaled 2, and a wave forward signaled a break between words or messages. Certain flag waves were determined for each letter of the alphabet so words could be spelled out. The challenges that larger and more complex armies created for long-distance military communication increased the need to establish a separate communications branch. However, since no other armies in the world contained such an organization, and the need for a specialized communications branch was not generally recognized, Congress and the Army were resistant to this new idea. But as tests of the new wigwag were exceeding expectations, it was becoming clear that the need for an organized signaling system was imminent. On March 29, 1860, the House approved the Army Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 1861 with the following amendment attached. For the manufacture or purpose of apparatus and equipment for field signals, $2,000. And that there be added to the staff of the Army 1 signal officer with the rank, pay, and allowance of a major of cavalry who shall have charge under the direction of Secretary of War of all signal duty and all books, papers, and apparatus connected therewith. Boy, the Army's kind of dry when they're all about business. Despite opposition from Jefferson Davis, among others, the Senate accepted the amendment and President James Buchanan signed the Appropriations Bill into law on June 24, 1860, bringing to life the U.S. Army Signal Corps. On June 27th of that same year, Myers was appointed as signal officer with the rank of major.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are there any significances between the 2 flags because one's red and one's white?
Yes. So now I'll kind of bring that up here in just a minute, but they use different colors because they would be in different lighting, and so they would use the appropriate color for if it was daytime, nighttime, that kind of thing. So the beginning of the Signal Corps was not without problems, as it took almost 3 years before President Abraham Lincoln would sign into bill a law that would provide staff for this new military branch. On April 28, 1863, Meyer appeared before the Central Board, which unanimously recommended him for the position of Chief Signal Officer with the rank of Colonel. So, they started the Signal Corps, but he didn't have any men, and it took him, that long just to have men to help him. And what they would do is they would pull men from this part of the Army or that part of the Army, and they would come in and they would help them, but they could be pulled back at any time. So, he was really left with nobody. So that was why it was so important that Abraham Lincoln signed that into effect. A U.S. Army signal party could be as small as an officer and 2 privates. Only the officer understood the code, and he was responsible for encoding and decoding messages. The enlisted men would flag the signals and assist in reading incoming signals, which were given to the officer for translation. Signal men were selected by examinations and were generally more educated. Commissioned officers were tested in reading and writing, composition, arithmetic, chemistry, natural philosophy, surveying, and topography. A lot of officers originally went for this, and then they walked away from it because if they got tested and they did poorly, it would actually reflect in their record. So when they found that out, they walked away and decided they wanted no part of the Signal Corps at that point. Not only were they expected to serve as communicators, but they also assisted commanders with reconnaissance and surveillance by virtue of their location at high points in the terrain and their mobility. The life of signalmen could be behind the lines, enjoying the good food and comfort of the commander's headquarters, or in advance of the army, exposed to the elements in remote and isolated locations, experiencing hardship and danger. The regulation signal equipment carried by a signal officer during the Civil War comprised of 3 parts: the kit, the canteen, and the haversack. The canvas kit contained the flags, staffs, torches, a torch case, and a warmer used to extract the wick if it became lodged inside the torch. These were rolled together and bound by straps. The copper canteen carried 1/2 gallon of turpentine or other flammable fluid to fuel the torches. The haversack housed wicking, matches, pliers, shears, a funnel, 2 flame shades, and a wind shade. All 3 pieces had shoulder straps by which the officer would carry them. The flags were tied to a hickory staff constructed of 4-foot jointed sections. The Signal Corps most commonly used 4-foot flags attached to a 12-foot staff, while white being the most versatile color. Red flags were generally used at sea. Under exceptional circumstances, when a flagman had to seek shelter while signaling or did not want to attract the enemy's attention, he used the 2-foot flag known as the action flag. Signal torches were copper cylinders 18 inches long and 1 1/2 inches in diameter. The torch used cotton wicking, and the flagman attached it to the staff by clamp rings and screws. The flame shade, a circular piece of copper, prevented the flame from traveling down the side of the torch. The signalman also used a wind shade consisting of copper strips when necessary. The foot torch used as a reference, the foot torch was used as a reference point, was similar in structure but slightly wider. When flags or torches were not appropriate, signalmen could send messages by means of rockets or colored lights. Officers carried telescopes for reading signals at long distances and used binoculars or field glasses for reading messages at distances of 4 miles or less. So if you can imagine, these young men, they would stand on hilltops and they would have flags, as 12 feet high, as they said, and they would be for hours signaling these flags. So you had to have strong arms and a lot of stamina to do this job. Now, I don't know if it really made sense in that, now that when you know a lot about something, it seems clear. But what they would do is they would have the flags and they would message, they would they would do one side and then the other, and they would have an alphabet. And so they would actually have to do each letter, and so like A would be 1, 1, 2, 1. So that would be A. Now they would have sometimes these really long flags, and they would have to, carry them over, and they would spell out all kinds of messages, warning of incoming, the enemy. But also at night, they wouldn't use the flags at night. They actually had the torch that they would put between their legs, but they would also have the torch was actually, the flag was taken off and a torch was added to the stick instead. So they were wheeling these long sticks with a torch at the end.
There's a high, how should I put it, incidence of they'd be an ideal target for sharpshooters. They're up there for, God knows how long.
Yes.
Was there a high attrition rate in those guys?
Yes. One thing that with all of these forms of communication, you are putting yourself out there, and all of them had their high fatality rates. So they were just as high as the men out in the battlefield. So that was a problem. You're standing up there and everyone can see you, not just, the good guys, the bad guys, either way you want to look at it. So finishing up on the flags themselves, they came in 7 varieties of colors and sizes to provide optimal visibility under prevailing conditions. The light colors were used to signal against dark backgrounds and vice versa. They were made of cotton, linen, or other lightweight fabric. So at least the flags themselves were not very heavy. So this is actually a real standard issue Civil War Signal Corps kit. So these are the real flags, and then these would have been pieces of that would have gone together that the flags would have attached to. Now this here, this is actually a rarity. That is actually an unused flare. So they had flares in their kits. It is an unfired Civil War Army and Naval signal rocket. So, so this is what they would have actually looked like. I mean, not very, there's really not much to them. It's just a flag, but very vital in communicating, a message. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Confederates with this. So the Confederates had a signal corps as well. On April 19, 1862, the Confederate Congress authorized the establishment of the Confederate Signal Corps. The first chief signal officer was Captain William Norris. The Confederate Signal Corps performed duties and utilized equipment very similar to their northern counterparts, with some exceptions. Now, the electric telegraph was not used in tactical battlefield communications due to shortages of telegraph wire and trained operators. Their aerial telegraphy was performed with similar flags, but with slightly modified codes and movements from the Meyer method. So by aerial telegraphy, telegraphy is actually a general term for conveying information. So we have the electric telegraph, and then you have the aerial telegraphy. And by aerial, they just mean just in the air, sending a message. Unlike the Union Signal Corps, however, the Confederate Signal Corps also was chartered to conduct espionage for the South. Acting as the Secret Service of the Confederacy, the Corps administered the secret line, an information network that ran between Richmond and the North and extended into Canada. It is because of its clandestine nature that much of the work of the Confederate Signal Corps is lost to history. Many of its records were burned in the fall of Richmond and in a subsequent fire at Norris's home, which claimed his personal papers. So that is one reason why there's such little information that I could find. I found no pictures, no anything on the Confederates, just a little information. Now, ironically, even though it was a man from the North that came up with a wigwag system, it was a Confederate soldier that used wigwag flags in battle first. At the first Battle of Bull Run, Confederate Captain Edward Porter Alexander made history by transmitting the first message in combat using signal flags over a long distance. Stationed atop Signal Hill in Manassas, Alexander saw Union troop movement and signaled to the brigade under Colonel Nathan Shanks Evans. His message was, "Look out for your left, your position is turned," which meant that they were in danger of being attacked on their left flank. Upon receiving this message, General Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnson sent timely reinforcement that turned the tide of the battle in the Confederates' favor. So actually the only thing I could find was this monument. Now this monument actually has, "Look out for your left, you are turned." And the Signal Corps Association, but they don't have on here that it's Confederate in any way. So I thought that was quite interesting. Now, we talked about being able to read one another's messages. The U.S. Naval Academy adopted Meyer's signals in July of 1862 and began teaching signaling courses. And in 1863, the United States Military Academy at West Point began teaching signaling courses as well. This meant that officers from both sides would have been familiar with the wigwag system and the associated codes. So both were used by Union and Confederate armies. Since wigwag allowed for long-range communication, they were easily intercepted by the enemy. Because of this, messages needed to be encrypted by using codes and ciphers. One of the tools Signal Corps members carried was a 2-disc device that permitted them to dial different codes. By signaling to the recipient what cipher the corpsmen were using, those who needed to would be able to decipher the messages. This proved to be very successful and proved a high degree of security. Just that little tiny wheel, just moving it around was enough. They didn't have computers, apparently, because they would have cracked it like that nowadays. The Confederates also had a cipher system called the court cipher, or pardon me, I'm not exactly sure how this is pronounced. It's visionnaire. This was a letter substitution code dating back to the 1500s. The key points of this cipher are the table and the key. There was also an automated decoding machine invented to speed up the process. In order to decrypt the note, a person needed 2 things. First, it would be the table, much like the one we see in the photo. A Viennere table is nothing more than the alphabet written on 26 lines, which with each new line being offset by 1 letter from the previous line. It was a tool used to help decrypt the message. The second requirement for decrypting the visionnaire cipher is knowing the keyword or phrase that was used to create the message. It was almost impossible to decode this message without knowing that keyword or phrase. The Confederacy utilized several key phrases for their ciphers, including "Our destiny is won," "Complete victory," and "Come retribution" was the key phrase used in the ciphers in the final months of the war. So this is actually a little confusing, but once you kind of get it, it makes sense. But they would send you a code, and then you would, it's really kind of hard to show on here, but the code would like go across the top, and then you would have to know what the phrase was, because you would go down and across, and it was that phrase that told you how far to go down and how far to go across. And that's why if you didn't have that key phrase, you would never be able to solve it, because it's just a bunch of random letters then. So it's kind of a complicated and yet very simple at the same time system. So perched on hilltops and in tree roosts, in fort towers and on sailing vessels, both Union and Confederate Signal Corps maintained lines of communication day and night through much of the war. The method proved most valuable when other means such as telegraph and couriers were cut off altogether. Some relays stretched as far as 30 miles. If signalmen were in a fairly permanent location, a tall wooden signal tower would often be built. Otherwise, members would use whatever was available to them to reach the highest elevation. The distance between signal stations was usually determined by how far the signalman could see with a spyglass, and it was not often more than 6 miles. So that's why you would have someone here, you would have someone here, you would have someone here. So you would be relaying a message, and they could do that up to probably about 30 miles, they said. Attracting the attention of someone you want to give a signal message posed to be a problem. This was addressed in a government instruction booklet from 1864 and advises the corpsmen that attracting attention should never be abandoned until every device has been exhausted, and they should be renewed and continued at different hours of the day and night. And there really wasn't many options to attract attention. It ranged from running back and forth to just waving the flag. So it was very a problem. We had talked about how dangerous it was being this job. Being in such highly visible locations, they were often the target of sharpshooters. So it was definitely a risky job to have. Meyer's interest did not lie solely in the wigwag. He also had an interest in the electric telegraph. By June 1861, Myers was lobbying the Secretary of War for the signal officer of the Army to be responsible for the telegraph. His plan, in his own words, he wanted an organize a telegraph signal train to accompany the army on its march. The wagons of the train to carry all articles needed for temporary telegraphic uses on the field, that is, apparatus and supplies for the use of both electric and aerial telegraphs, rockets, and composition night signals, carefully prepared, packed, numbered, and arranged for instant use. So he was head of the Signal Corps, but he also wanted the telegraph. He wanted to be in charge of that as well. Oh, maybe I should tell you. So this is actually, what he was talking about, a wagon train of military telegraphic corps. So they would actually follow the men out to battle. If it worked, Meyer's plan would have provided a significant enhancement to the capability of the Union Army. However, he was faced with two significant problems. First, the existing telegraph equipment required the transporting of large batteries to the power lines. Those batteries were needed to power the telegraph. Second, he required skilled telegraphists to operate the equipment. Meyer therefore wanted to find a way of simplifying the process of sending telegraphic messages, and he thought he found the solution in the Beardslee Telegraph machine. So the principal advantages of this is that it could operate without batteries and by men who didn't know Morse code. The key to this was that it operated using magnetos. It generated its own power. These generated the power to send electricity over the telegraph wire. In theory, the operator need only move the lever to a point on the dial representing the letter he wished to send as part of his message. On the receiving end, the pointer would move to the corresponding position on the dial. Thus, the information is sent exactly as it was meant to be sent, and theoretically without error. The operator need only copy down the characters he saw dialed. So if you can see on here, what it would do is you would just put it on the letter, send it, put it on the letter, send it. So it was much easier than doing Morse code. Meyer received his first Beardslee in May 1862, and they were deployed in the Second Manassas Campaign at Fredericksburg that winter. Unfortunately, when operating under the pressure of real-time operations, the Beardslee wasn't as promising as many had hoped. The machine required lots of maintenance. They were heavy when they needed to be fixed. They actually had to go back to the city. They didn't send signals as far as the battery-powered devices, and the device did not endear itself to the professional telegraphic community. They did not like it. They were not happy. Myers was obsessive over making the electric telegraphy part of the Signal Corps that it eventually got him fired from his position within the Signal Corps. Meyer's interest in the telegraph actually was justified. The telegraph allowed for near real-time two-way communication, which allowed senior commanders to have control over the battlefield that never had been seen before in the United States. Prior to the Civil War, communications would have been slow, often through written word or by word of mouth, conceivably taking days or weeks by horseback. But the invention of the telegraph ushered the United States into an era of near-instant communications. The Civil War was the first armed conflict in the United States to fully embrace the use of the telegraph technology, and by the end of the war, the telegraph would prove to be invaluable. So just a little bit of quick information about telegraph. It was developed by Samuel Morse, among others. It revolutionized long-distance communication by transmitting electrical signals over wire laid between stations. In 1843, he convinced the Congress to appropriate $30,000 to build a telegraph line between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. And on May 24, 1844, the historic first message was sent. Anyone know what that message was? You kind of can't read it on there. So his first message that was transmitted read, "What hath God wrought?" And it's really, really hard to see all these old photos, but this is actually the original message here. So by 1852, there were over 23,000 miles of telegraphic wires in the United States of America. So we had telegraph before the war began. It used a system of clicks to send and receive messages. These clicks are made when the sending apparatus or key is depressed and released from the transmitter, breaking an electric current. A dot is a short tap on the key and a dash is a long tap. The current travels by wire to electromagnet in the receiver, which pulls a lever down, making a clicking noise. Each letter of the alphabet is represented by some combination of these dots and dash known as Morse code. So this was Morse's first rendition of his code. Never tested in a time of crisis in the United States, Abraham Lincoln embraces the use of the telegraph, and in doing so, revolutionized the presidency, along with how war would be conducted. He was the first president to be able to communicate with the officers on the battlefield and spent most of his time visiting the telegraph office to get the latest news, monitor battlefield reports, lead strategy meetings, and deliver orders to his men. He would read all messages and would go through the stack until he got to where he read the last one. He would even read over the shoulders of the telegraphers as messages were coming in. He actually sent very few messages himself, less than one a month for the first year, but that changed as he grew increasingly frustrated with the war's progress. However, it is said that he has sent over less than 1,000 telegrams over the course of the war, which is kind of surprising. I thought it would be more like thousands and thousands. The United States Military Telegraph, or USMT, was a civilian organization which initially provided only medium and long-range telegraphic communications. A corps was composed of about 150 men with a requisite number of wagons and pack mules. A squad of these men was assigned to each corps headquarters and was always in readiness to put up new lines or remove those already up at a moment's notice from commanding general. The large wire was wound on wheels and placed in wagons, which drove along the route where the line was to be erected, the men following and putting up the wire as it was unreeled. The work was done with great rapidity and seldom became disarranged. The first lines were used when McClellan was organizing the army at Arlington, and it was only intended for temporary use. The poles were not required to be very substantial and could be always found in wooded country near any proposed route. The immense labor required in the construction of this telegraph led to the adoption of insulated wire, which could be used with very little trouble. A coil would be placed on a mule's back, and the animal led straight forward without halting while the wire unreeled, and only being necessary for 2 men to follow and hang up the line on fences and bushes where it would not be run over. When the telegraph extended through a section unoccupied by our troops, cavalry patrols watched it, and by holding the inhabitants responsible for its safety, generally prevented any interference with the line. The Central Telegraph Office was in the War Department building, from which a network of wires radiated in every direction. President Lincoln visited this office and spent many evenings sitting at the instruments, reading the reports as they came in and were recorded by the operators. From May 1st, 1861 to June 30th, 1865, they handled some 6.5 million messages for a total cost for construction, repair, and operation of the network of $2,655,000, or about 41 cents per message. During the war, they built 15,000 miles of line, often in adverse conditions and sometimes under enemy fire. At its peak, in 1865, they consisted of over 8,000 miles of military telegraph line and another 5,000 miles of commercial lines operated by military telegraphers. Today, those same telegrams would cost $8.84 per message, and the total construction would be $57,250,000. I actually think that's probably would be a good deal with everything costing in the billions, actually. So maybe they were doing something right back then. So wigwag and the telegraph were the most important methods of communication during the Civil War, but how they attained their information often came from unconventional sources. A bird's eye view would certainly give an advantage over the enemy, so both Union and Confederate armies utilized the idea of balloons as reconnaissance. While the idea of using a balloon during war was not a new one, this marked the first time that they were used in the United States. Thaddeus Lowe and John Lamontagne were pivotal in getting the idea of balloons off the ground. After witnessing a balloon demonstration near the White House in 1861, Abraham Lincoln became an active proponent of using balloons to assist the war effort. Major General George McClellan greatly valued the intelligence derived from aerial observation, and many senior federal officers, including McClellan, Fitz John Porter, Joe Hooker, and George Custer, made ascents in the balloon. In the summer of that same year, President Lincoln established the Balloon Corps, a civilian organization under the authority of the Union's Bureau of Topographical Engineers, and named Lowe the chief aeronaut for the Army. So what I have here is actually the first message that was sent from a balloon via telegraph. On June 17, 1861, on the grounds of Columbia Armory in Washington, the specially equipped Enterprise, that was the name of the balloon, ascended on tether lines with Lowe and representatives of the American Telegraph Company to a height of 500 feet. Through equipment aboard the ship and cables running along one of the rigging lines to the ground, so they had the telegraph inside and they had lines going down to the ground. From there to the telegraph receiving rooms in the War Department and the White House, Thaddeus Lowe transmitted the first telegraphic message from the air, and it read, "To the President of the United States, Sir, this point of observation commands an area nearly 50 miles in diameter. The city, with its girdle of encampments, presents a superb scene. I take great pleasure in sending you this first dispatch ever telegraphed from an aerial station, and in acknowledging my indebtedness to your encouragement for the opportunity of demonstrating the availability of the science of aeronauts in the military service of this country. Yours respectfully, T.S. Lowe." Seemed kind of wordy for a message going from a balloon to the ground. So balloons were normally inflated with city gas when it was available, but they would only have access in large cities like Washington and Richmond. To overcome this issue, Lowe designed special inflation wagons that would inflate the balloons while in the field. Charged with dilute sulfuric acid and iron filings, they generated hydrogen. These portable gas generation wagons gave the Union balloonists the ability to deploy more freely in the field. So as you can see here, these are the generators. As you imagine, they probably weren't easy to maneuver around. Because balloons are unpredictable and where they will travel, they were always tethered to the ground. Although they were tied down and there were many attempts, there were no balloons shot down by the enemy. This is because the high altitudes gave them the advantage of seeing where the enemy was, but the height also kept them out of firing range. Messages were communicated through telegraph or these signal flags. So this is just a rendition of what the balloons look like, but they were clearly very colorful. Lowe actually thought that the sight of the balloon watching over them would disconcern the Confederates. He thought it'd make him nervous just seeing that balloon out there all colored. So whether it did or not, I'm not sure. However, the Confederates utilized balloons as well. However, they did not have access to the supplies that the North did, so their use was very limited. Confederate General James Longstreet wrote, "The Federals have been using balloons in examining our positions, and we watched with curious eyes their beautiful observations as they floated high up in the air and well out of the range of our guns. We longed for the balloons that poverty denied us." They did manage to fashion a balloon out of ladies' dress silk of different patterns that was brought in Savannah and Charleston. This multicolored patchwork creation of various materials earned their balloon the nickname the silk dress balloon. It worked well, however, it met its demise when the balloon was loaded onto an armed tug that was fired upon and then captured by the North. The balloon was given to Thaddeus Lowe, who cut it up into scraps and gave it as souvenirs. So the photo you see here is actually a scrap of that balloon. And I'm not sure if you can see it because the lights are on, but there are various patterns from the different styles of dress silk they used in the construction. Like there's one pattern here and one pattern here and a pattern there. And what they would do to construct these balloons was actually pretty interesting. They would construct them out of silk, and then they would put like a varnish on them. And I guess it actually worked really well. It's just, they just didn't have access to the equipment. So now I am kind of running long, so I'm going to cut this short, but I did find an article that was printed in the paper in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser in September 4th, 1862. It is really interesting. It's kind of long, so I'm not going to read it. If you want to read it afterwards, I can. But basically, it gives an account of what it's like seeing battle from up in the balloon. It's really an amazing advantage point. But it was a telegrapher who actually wrote this out, you know, everything he saw, but his last words were, "This is beyond question one of the most remarkable feats of ingenuity of man has ever yet compassed." So he is saying how amazing these balloons are, and yet just a short time later, this appeared in a news article, and it said, "The end of ballooning in the Army. On the 18th, 7 balloons, gas generators on wheels, retorts, and all the ballooning apparatus of the federal armies are to be put up at auction at Washington and sold to the highest bidder. Ballooning as a means of making military observation has proved a failure." So in one hand, they're saying best invention, and not much time afterwards, it was a failure. The experiment and demonstration of the balloon as a means of observation and reconnaissance was a resounding success. However, there were difficulties in transporting, and disagreements between Lowe and the Army brought an end to the Balloon Corps well before the war would end. The Balloon Corps disbanded by 1863, and the balloons were sold at auction. Examining the role communication played during the Civil War helps us gain an understanding that the ability to gather intelligence was vital to bringing victory to the North. The role the telegraph played, while significant, would not have been successful on its own. And a telegraph sent early in the war reiterates this when it reveals that Grant is communicating to someone else through the telegraph, letting him know that he is only able to communicate with another general through the written word. It was not flags, telegrams, or balloons that won the war. It was brave young men who were willing to risk their lives for the freedom of others. These jobs put these men in dangerous situations, but they knew it was a job that needed to be done, and they were willing to sacrifice their lives in the process. So, thank you.